Hello and welcome to a special interview episode of Adult Music. Tonight, got a real treat talking with the great alto saxophonist Rudresh Mahanthappa.
Yeah, he's a favorite of ours. He certainly came to our attention years ago when we heard the Bird Calls album. This is in 2015. I remember sitting on your sofa listening to this album and just being completely knocked out. Yeah. I think I even remember the beer I was drinking.
Yeah, we had to pause to digest all that we heard and probably ate that day.
I think it took a few years for me to digest that.
Anyway, Rudresh has got an upcoming debut gig at Smoke Jazz Club in New York, Thursday to Sunday, August 25th to 28th. So anyone who can get down to New York, you're in for a great evening of music there. It's a Charlie Parker celebration, building on some of the ideas from the Bird Calls recording with his trio that he's working with now.
Well, it's going to be mostly he said the Hero Trio album because it's a trio. There's no piano. That's
right.
Going to change things quite a bit.
So it should be really exciting. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this wonderful interview with Rudresh Mahanthappa. Rudresh, thanks so much for joining us here on Adult Music.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And this is a real pleasure for us. It's interesting, too, because in our last episode, we were just talking about you. We had discussed Michael Dease's new release.
Best Next Thing.
Oh, man, that's a great record, man.
It's
Michael,
a great record.
Woo, he's scary trombone player.
The sort of standout track for us was his Horse Trading, which was this like killer tempo, kind of bluesy number. Then you solo first on that. And it's one of your kind of really from outer space solos that you go wild on.
Well, I got to check it out. I didn't listen to the album. You play on these albums and then you don't listen to them, so I got to check it out.
Anyway, I once heard a description of a David Liebman solo as an artful strangulation of the saxophone. That's kind of the impression I got there. But then Deese had to come up and solo after you at that tempo. And man, he must have burnt up all the lube on that slide. He's an amazing player.
He really is. He's a monster. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
He's also a great saxophonist. Did you know that?
I saw on his Facebook he's doing some videos with sax too. Just a little clip I saw.
Yeah, and he's a good bass player too. He's just an amazing musician.
Yeah, wow. Really exciting.
He's something else.
Good compositions. So we had kind of heard you playing back in the earlier 2000s with Vijay Iyer and other things. But I think the first time Mike and we heard you together was with Bird Calls. Mike was over at my house. And we put it on, and listened to it together. And
made a big impression.
Yeah, wow. We had to take a break after that just to sort of, figure out what we heard. So that was really exciting. And the whole kind of concept of that you took little excerpts from, Charlie Parker's compositions and solos, and then built something really original and new on that. It was really thrilling. And then we were excited to hear the Hero tribute also, 2020. And then you're down to a chordless trio format. And
right.
That was interesting. Of course, you have more harmonic freedom, but I think you have a lot of that all the time. But the extra space and the way you filled it was really interesting there. How do you find going from the quintet to the trio now? Is there any other kind of insights or feelings you've gotten from that?
Well, it's funny because I always liked the trio. I always liked playing trio when I was in college. I thought that, that was it. Like I didn't want any chordal instruments. I didn't want piano. I didn't want guitar. So it's always funny to me that it took this long to actually make a trio album. I think my very first album, which is out of print and difficult to find, there are a few trio tracks on there. But so I guess that's to say that it feels very natural. In a lot of ways, the quintet was different for me because it's very rare that I play with another horn player. There's this front line, there's an interaction with another horn player. The only other person I've done that with really besides Adam O'Farrell is Steve Lehman, who's also a great alto player. We used to have a band together. But the trio, it has this flexibility and just this malleability that's very special, especially considering that it's with Francois Moutin and Rudy Royston, two people I've been playing with for really over 20 years. So, we have this special connection that's kind of undeniable. So I don't know. I just, regardless of what sort of ensemble, what sort of instrumentation, what the mission and message of the project is, I feel like, I'm always me, and I'm always trying to express, my personality, and, the compositions or the instrumentation is definitely informing that. But I'm the constant, and that's not really going to change. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing going from the Charlie Parker inspiration is all the other kind of things you picked up on for a hero tribute. A Keith Jarrett tune without piano.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
that's one of my favorite tunes. In fact, the wind up.
Yeah.
Anyone who wants to listen to that.
Stevie Wonder and the Johnny Cash really knocked me out. That was a lot of fun too. And then the follow up, the EP you did this year with Animal Crossing. You've got the video game tune there, which a lot of people could identify with. Pat Metheny, Chuck Mangione, coming from upstate New York, that was a name I grew up with. And then
absolutely.
George Michael too, right? That was a lot of fun because you could play around with the groove and everyone gets into the groove, but then you did kind of like a Giant Steps thing with the harmony in there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And again, it being trio, I feel like we can kind of snake in and out of these things in a very subtle way that maybe is not possible when there's a chordal instrument. And there's this high level of sensitivity that, Francois can go with me or he can lay it down. But I guess kind of the sonic density stays the same, which kind of maybe gives us more flexibility in other ways.
Right. And Rudy Royston, he's such a, whenever I think of his playing, the word finesse comes to my mind because he can do a lot with a little, or he can also really whip it up, and you get all sorts of feels from him, and he adjusts to a real variety of ensembles. We listen to lots of Positone releases, and he seems to fit in any setting really seamlessly.
Yeah, for sure. He can do a lot of things. It's funny. I think there were some gigs he had with me that were right after some gigs he did with Bill Frisell. And the project with Frisell and Thomas Morgan is this very quiet, understated, kind of dreamy thing. And then, the next day he was just, he had to hit hard with me. So it was pretty hilarious because it was such a 180. But he plays beautifully, in any situation. Rudy came up playing with Ron Miles, the great trumpet player, when he was very young. We're all Colorado guys. We're all, kind of born in the early 70s, grew up in Colorado. And Ron's projects had a really wide scope from being, very quiet to being very bashy. And Rudy, I think from a young age, was embracing that sort of wide breadth of sound and scope that I think it's kind of natural to him in a way that it might not be to others, mainly because of playing with Ron.
Right. So you've got all these different influences, for the tune composing, but now the chance that we get to talk to you today, it's back to Charlie Parker for your gig coming up at Smoke Jazz Club. So this is your first performance there. It's going to be your debut, right?
Yeah, it's my first show at Smoke, that's for sure. And it's also my first time playing in New York since the early 2019.
Okay.
Obviously the pandemic put the kibosh on some things, but the Hero Trio was actually supposed to play in May of 2020, and so playing in New York got very delayed. So I'm excited to go out there and hit, and to have 4 nights in a row is really going to be fun.
So Charlie Parker's birthday, it's the night after, it's August 29th, right? So he was born in 1920. And Smoke, they had the Bird at 100 release with Vincent Herring, Bobby Watson, and Gary Bartz, 2019, the year before. And now you're going to be there with this as a Charlie Parker celebration theme, right?
Right. So it kind of informally so. I mean, we're not going to play any music from Bird Calls because that doesn't really work as a trio, but we're going to play some Charlie Parker tunes kind of rearranged, and standards that he loved to play, like stuff like I'll Remember April, and, I think standards that he's very much tied to. And just the fact that, a lot of what Charlie Parker's MO was taking, we think of standards, we talk about standards in the American Songbook, but those were all pop tunes at the time, right? There wasn't, they weren't this historical thing. They were very current. And I think, in that spirit, I think playing the theme from Animal Crossing or playing a George Michael tune, or, I think that's very much in the spirit of what Charlie Parker was doing back then. And I think it's important to keep that in our, view, in our purview as jazz musicians.
Right. The spirit rather than just the copying the form or something. Sure.
Exactly. I think, he gave us a lot musically, but I think his artistic attitude and his vision are just as important as the things that he played,
Right.
I think that's kind of 50% of his gifts to us. I think that we don't necessarily talk about in academia, or when we're studying Charlie Parker. We don't talk about the vibe and the spirit. We talk about what he played over D minor 7, so he had to balance that out.
One of the things I've heard you mention about his playing that doesn't get talked about a lot, but I also notice in your playing is his phrasing and ability to, start a phrase almost anywhere. It's different. A lot of, musicians, I think we're like boxers who need to be set before they can throw a punch. And there's a few boxers who can punch sort of while they're moving back or whatnot. And when I listen to Charlie Parker again, and I hear it in your playing and some players, that phrases can start in odd places in solos and then be connected in new and interesting ways. And I think at that time, he was really innovative in starting different ways of phrasing.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I'm very flattered that you say that about my playing. That's something I've definitely thought about because, as human beings, we, the way we speak, we're always placing things in different sorts of cadences, right? So I really think that music should reflect that. And Charlie Parker in particular, there's always a feeling that he's talking to you. It has this, even if you've heard one of his solos 100 times, it has this very spontaneous quality. And I think comedians have that. I think great comedians have that sort of timing.
Right.
And I think, great extemporaneous speakers have that ability and trying to kind of equate music and speech and the way we talk. I think that actually kind of humanizes what we're doing instead of it being this set sort of thing. And we always start our phrase on the upbeat of one and we end here, because no one really thinks like that or talks like that. So I'm not really sure that we should play like that.
Exactly. I've got some more questions about language and music for you later. But with this gig also, you've got a different bass player here, right? Harish Raghavan?
Yeah, right. I've been wanting to play with Harish for a while. We've known each other for many years. He's a bit younger than me, but he's really, really great. And he's, playing with lots of great players. So this was a good opportunity. Francois is kind of split between here and Europe with a lot of his work. And, he wasn't around for this. And I saw it as an opportunity to play with someone else.
Right. I see he's got a new album, or just came out at the end of July. That's on our list of things to listen to, too.
Yeah, and it's on the same label. It's the same British label, Whirlwind, that I've been working with. Yeah, and, I think he had some gigs coming up with Charles Lloyd, and, he's played a lot with Ambrose Ekin-Musere. One time we were on a double bill in Warsaw together, and he was playing with Kurt Elling. That was 10 years ago. He's just done a lot of stuff. He's very versatile, and he has a really big sound, and he has a very wide beat that's, I think, is going to be particularly fun in a trio setting with Rudy.
That's really cool. So anyone in the New York area, if you can, get down to Smoke Jazz Club, August 25th to 28th. And you're going to hear, sounds like a little bit of Charlie Parker inspiration, but lots of other sort of things with this trio. That'd be great. I wish we were in New York, but we're too far away in Japan to go. Most important question. Are you going to wear the superhero outfits?
Oh, man. We've been threatening to wear them for quite a while. When we played in Europe, I meant to bring the capes at least, but then I forgot them while I was packing. But one of these days we're going to do it. I don't think it's going to be this time, but.
So are you the owner of all of the all of the costumes? Or
I am, and I was amazed that the guys were willing. When I brought up the idea, I was like, we're going to dress like superheroes, and I'm going to buy all this clothes. That they were actually down to do it. I guess they trusted me.
Yeah, they look great. And on the what we're talking about, just for listeners, is on the Hero Trio album. There's a photo of Rudresh with Francois Mouton and Rudy Royston in in capes and really shiny pants, and masks, looking really
shiny pants, yeah,
superhero like.
Well, the funny thing, it's very, very difficult to find superhero clothing that's not branded. That doesn't have Marvel or DC on it. So it actually took a good bit of work to put those outfits together.
That's funny. Oh, yeah.
And I have to say also, I think Rudy after asked me if he could keep the gold pants.
Wonder where else he's going to wear them to.
He looks good in them, I have to say. Yeah.
He does.
Yeah. Well, we're about the same age, Rudresh, and I know you mentioned you grew up in the 80s like me, and you had a lot of sort of soul and jazz rock inspiration. David Sanborn, Brecker Brothers. And I was listening to this stuff too. But this is pre-internet when we grew up. Now you can just go online and find all these things to listen to. So I got into pre-bebop and post-bop music by listening to college radio and then going to the local library and borrowing vinyl. I've seen you mention the influence of your brother. Well, how did you get into more traditional jazz growing up in Colorado?
That was mainly through my teacher. I had a really great saxophone teacher who was actually a colleague and friend of Ron Miles. Used to play with him all the time. This guy named Mark Harris. He was my teacher from when I started playing in 4th grade all the way till I left for college, and he just turned me on to a lot of different music. I remember even just that first year studying with him, we were listening to Paul Desmond plays the music of Simon and Garfunkel. I think that was on on the cassette deck, and Brecker Brothers Heavy Metal Bebop, some Yellow Jackets albums. Also, the father of my best friend was kind of an amateur jazz musician, and he turned me on to Grover Washington. So that was my entry point into music that had saxophone, that was dealing with improvisation, and then I kind of worked backwards, and then it was, it went from Grover Washington to Charlie Parker. I had this book, there's this famous book of Charlie Parker transcriptions called the Omni Book, that a lot of people have, a lot of musicians have. And I remember being at, there used to be a record store chain called Musicland that would be in a lot of malls. Yeah. And I remember being at Musicland, and I picked up this double LP of Charlie Parker's The Savoy recordings, and I turned it over and I saw that almost all of those tunes were in the Omni Book. So that's when I kind of sat down. It was amazing to me to be able to hear those solos and see it also, see the notes flying by. And, I think after hearing Charlie Parker, I was kind of hooked. I had a band in 9th grade that was trying to, play bird tunes, butchering bird tunes, I should say. But,
got to start somewhere.
So that was kind of my entry. So for me, it was like working backwards. I started with the jazz, rock, soul, fusion stuff, and then went to bird, and then kind of worked my way forward slowly. But again, going back to my teacher, he was an eclectic musician himself. He I would go see him play. One night it might be with a big band, another night might be an Afro pop band. Another might be, 2 saxophones and a drummer, going crazy. So from very early on, there was no sense of any genre being bad or any kind of subgenre of jazz being invalid. It was more about stuff being played well, and I didn't know the word at the time, but I think ultimately, music that was played with integrity. So, and he would always bring over a few LPs every week, and it was always, just a wide variety of stuff. It would be, Stravinsky and Yes and Sidney Bechet, maybe. And then, the next week, it might be Ornette and Bach and, something else. I don't know, So I was listening to all of this music at the same time. It actually wasn't until I went to college that I really heard people talk about hard bop and bebop and avant-garde. Those are words I didn't really even... Maybe if I'd heard them before, I didn't really take them seriously, because even when I was in high school, Ornette was as great as Bird for me, and they were, peas in a pod. I didn't think of one being out and the other being straight ahead, or I just, so, I've had to learn that since, but what that lingo is, but I firmly, my aesthetic and my beliefs are very much against all of that. So I have to thank Mark Harris, my teacher, for a lot of my perspective.
Right. That seems to have influenced your concept of being able to still mix all these influences of different genres and sort of make them seem like, oh, of course.
Yeah, definitely. And the idea of trying to be a unique musical personality but that's still evolving too, that you're not satisfied and not set, and also not trying to copy anybody else, all
Right.
of those things kind of working together.
Now, one of the things I want to ask you about is ethnic influences. You have mentioned that, you grew up, you weren't exposed much to Indian music, despite, being Indian American, but there were certain expectations as, an Indian American jazz musician, sort of put upon you or suggested. But
Absolutely,
later on, you actually informally went to India to study Indian music with Carnatic saxophone playing, and also this other recording you did that I'm still trying to get my head wrapped around. I've heard it a couple times. Is this Korean shamanistic music from Mudang Rock? That was really kind of something interesting to listen to. Now, I think, in jazz since the 60s, and then even in pop music with the Beatles, that sort of Indian music coming into all the modal things is sort of in people's consciousness since that time. How do you feel about Indian music and these other kind of ethnic explorations now? Has it just become sort of part of your sound as like the sort of harmonic toolkit that you might go into something that you've absorbed from that?
Yeah, I think at this point it's part of my musical DNA. Like, I don't really think about it, but I think I also did go through a period of explicitly trying to, work on these things and express them. I think it's kind of like when you're trying to, learn a new word or learn a new language, you do these kind of very academic things, and then they start feeling natural. And I feel like that's essentially what I did with the concepts of Indian music that I was interested in. But, it was all coming from a place of trying to express what it means to be Indian American. I mean, we didn't really have many role models.
Right.
I mean, I think my generation and maybe one generation older are kind of like the first Indian Americans, right? Or at least in critical mass. So the idea of expressing this identity and trying to figure out what the identity is, at least for me, and then expressing it. So I guess that's to say that thinking about ways where Indian music can conceptually commingle with jazz wasn't coming from a place of as much of an aesthetic place initially as it was as just kind of a burning way of trying to express hybridity, the hybridity that was in me, burning in me every second of every day in positive ways and in confusing ways as well.
Right.
I always used to say that, in some ways, the music was this happy byproduct of me just trying to get to know myself.
Interesting.
It maybe wasn't even the intention in some cases,
Right. One of the things I've tried to do, picking music for the podcast we talk about, is with streaming now you can hear releases from all around the world, and I've tried to keep it as international as possible, and found these really thriving jazz scenes around the world in Italy, Scandinavia, surprisingly in Israel too,
and Greece, don't forget.
Yeah, in
They're
Greece,
big fans of ours.
But one of the cool things is I'm finding they're all bringing some part of their sort of native culture, the sounds that were around them, whether it's interesting meters and feels or different kind of modal scales into the music. And it makes it really interesting. And, as someone used to normally hearing traditional American jazz, I have to go back and listen a lot and say, oh, what is that? And that's kind of a scale I've never heard before and like that. But I find it really interesting. What do you think is the next kind of frontier with jazz absorbing? I always see jazz as a sponge. It's taken in lots of different styles of music. Do you see any other kind of new elements or ethnic influences making a big contribution?
Nothing really comes to mind. I mean, the frontier I see is more with, electronics and programming and, sonic stuff. And I think there's so much that's hasn't been tapped there. I see that, you know, people that are really truly improvising and developing vocabulary with some sort of electronic interface, I think. But as far as cultural influence, you know, I think there's actually so much of it. I can't imagine there being, there being anything new. I mean, it's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine, and you know, I did that album Kinsman that came out in 2008 with Kadri Gopalnath, with the Carnatic saxophonist, and at that time it was so unique. There wasn't really anything like it, and what we were talking about was if I were to do that project now, I think it would just going to go into an ether of lots of other projects like that.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. So, you know, there is this idea of some sort of global citizenship, and the fact that we have access to all this information, all this music from all over the world, literally, you know, in the palm of our hand on our phone is really remarkable. I do want to say, though, that I think we should draw a distinction between jazz and improvised music. I mean, I think there's a lot of great improvised music happening, but there's improvised music that's being called jazz that doesn't necessarily have a tie to the African American experience. It is not tied to Charlie Parker. It's people that haven't studied bebop, and you know,
right.
They haven't studied Coltrane, they haven't studied Duke Ellington, and so it gets a little bit funny. You know, jazz is the label we use for a lot of this music, but I don't think we should.
Right.
You know?
Right. There's that question of authenticity that comes up, right?
Right, exactly.
One interesting thing we found with this Scandinavian jazz, a lot of it is stereotyped as sort of being non-swinging, sort of cold sounding. And there is music like that I would say probably doesn't tie much to bebop and, you know, post-bop music. However, we found some really hard swinging Scandinavians. There's this drummer, Snorre Kirk, and he sort of plays in more of a swing and earlier idiom. And this fabulous trumpet player, Tobias Wickland, who's sort of going back to more Armstrong-inspired things while infusing lots of other interesting modern elements. So I kind of get inspired to see international jazz still maintaining some earlier elements of American music that most Americans have forgotten. You know, only jazz fans remember that.
Well, I think Jan Garbarek is a great example of, you know, a saxophonist who was, you know, a musician that was very much expressing his environment and his roots, but you can definitely hear Coltrane in what he's doing. You know, you can hear the history of jazz, I think. And he's been such a force. He has influenced, you know, a huge sector of the Nordic jazz scene. So, you know, I think there is a lot of authenticity out there. I think it's more like I remember doing it a workshop at a conservatory in Norway, and you know, and the students, they just wanted to play free, you know, and they couldn't really play on a blues or a standard, and so I was, you know, I had to kind of just understand and appreciate that they were dealing with improvised music, and it probably shouldn't be called jazz.
Right.
And once you accept that, then, you know, you can do interesting things. But it's not like that I have an agenda, but I think it's important to make the distinction.
Sure.
You know, Anders Mogensen, I don't know if you know Anders Mogensen. He's a killing, super swinging drummer from Copenhagen. He's one of the kind of the top call guys in the Danish scene. So, you know, these guys are out there for sure.
Yeah.
Let me ask. I'm really curious about how you build a solo. When I listen to you, I kind of get the impression, you know, all these notes are going by so fast. I almost feel like I'm Keanu Reeves in The Matrix, you know, learning kung fu in 3 seconds. You know, because they jack him into. I feel like all this information is just going directly into my brain. I can't really process it. How much of that is improvised? How much of it is planned out beforehand? What's in there?
Well, none of it is planned out beforehand. I mean, right. I'm, you know, I have my language as an improviser and the things that I've worked on and things that I've studied, and but I'm really just trying to react to my environment. I'm trying to react to the musicians around me. I'm trying to make sure that what I'm playing is actually related to, you know, to the song and the structure, and not just a set of chords or you know, some sort of framework, that it's actually related to a song, that it's kind of a continuation of that.
I see. Yeah.
And I think, it's the same thing again. I've worked on a lot of stuff, but I usually am, a big proponent of forgetting about it when you're actually up there playing with people and trying to interact and really trying not to force anything, because I feel like I've been blessed to play and still play with lots of great musicians that, they're feeding me information all the time. So I should listen, keep my ears open.
Right. One thing I want to ask you about, you made a recording in 2004, Mother Tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And this was based around recordings of different Indian languages, right? So
right.
One of the things that for my work-related research has been a relationship of music and language, more specifically related to language acquisition. And there's some interesting research that's been done and theories in that area. MRI scans show in the brain that music and language are activating the same centers in the brain. And there's some evolutionary theories that think language and music, developed in humans sort of together. And of course, music has syntax, but it doesn't have exact semantics like language to express a logical proposition. However, it can express sort of shared, emotional responses, and we can agree that this makes people feel sad or happy.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, in your experience, I know you have children as well, right?
Yes.
Watching your children grow up and learn language and maybe music in the home and in your work as a teacher, and then also related to this interesting recording of building music around these sort of language recordings. What do you see as the relationship between language and music?
Oh, I don't know if I've really thought about it in such discrete terms. I mean, I think that, that's a tough one. I mean, I feel like the idea of vocabulary, the idea of breaking things down to fundamental building blocks. I was talking to somebody the other day about how one of the best ways to approach some sort of intercultural or cross-cultural collaboration is to break concepts down to really small building blocks. And that way you can actually there are more points of relation, and then you can actually build, new language, or you can build a collaborative language. And that's something, that I firmly believe. I think, my son is 9.5, and we're just having these conversations about roots of words. And if you know this word, you actually know 10 other words. And if you know what this word in Latin means, you actually know 100 other words. And, and looking at music in kind of a similar way that, this little 3 or 4 note grouping actually, it's this tonality, but it can be this tonality, but it can also be this Indian raga, and it can also be this Iraqi maqam. And it's kind of seeing things from that perspective instead of trying to take on, the kind of larger concept of like, Indian music, Iraqi music, and it's like this huge ball that you're trying to swallow at once. So I think that's kind of the way I've thought about language. And then, when we talk about Charlie Parker, we're always talking about vocabulary. We talk about, bebop vocabulary. And that's kind of a funny thing because when we talk about bebop vocabulary in education circles, it's usually this very kind of codified thing that implies a sort of regurgitation. Mm-hmm. So again, we get to that place of like, well, so when does regurgitation turn into spontaneity, and how can we, encourage that? So those are some of the parallels I think about between music and language. I think there are other things that I've thought about too, but I always gravitate towards players that have a sort of, we could describe it as kind of a looseness, but it's more that like, it's almost like they're speaking, the way they play has a sort of vernacular to it that encourages familiarity. Because when you really think about it, Bird and Coltrane, if you're trying to understand what they're playing, it's pretty complicated stuff. But a musician that can somehow play that, but create that sort of that familiar energy that leads the listener to enjoy instead of try to understand, but still feel like a sense of communication. I mean, I think those are lofty things to strive towards, you know?
Right.
I think Michael Brecker was like that too. Michael Brecker plays some really, really crazy stuff if you dissect it. But he's doing it with like this almost kind of R&B saxophone sound, you know? So already like it's sonically familiar, so he can almost play anything he wants, you know? Those are things that really fascinate me. And I think actors and comedians and great public speakers, they all kind of embody that. I mean, I think JFK and Obama had a way of speaking that always kind of, even if they were talking about the worst things, that somehow you felt okay. Like there was like some sort of hope and humanity, you know?
Right. I know that Miles Davis had said one of his inspirations for phrasing was actually Orson Welles, you know, the cadence of his voice and in a sort of definitive way of saying something, even if the content isn't anything outstanding, you believe it, right?
Yeah, that's really cool. I never heard that. I'm going to think about that one. I like that a lot.
Yeah. One of the things I think these days with jazz education, there's so many super talented players with chops, but there's also a lot of players who sound exactly the same. And the other thing is, you know, the way music is recorded these days, there's a lot of solos that are great, but they just sound too perfect. And a lot of the trumpet heroes that I had were, you know, like Lee Morgan, Freddie Hubbard. And what I admired about their playing was the chances they took. You know, they would get themselves into almost an impossible spot over the harmonies or with some phrase that now needed to be answered or concluded. And they would find some way out of it. And you felt like you were on an adventure with them. And I think I hear that in your playing a lot too, sort of setting up musical problems and things that stack and then need to go in a certain direction. That always feels dangerous and exciting. What do you feel about, you know, sort of solo structures in jazz today and then in your own sort of playing?
Well, in my own playing, I've always enjoyed getting lost and trying to find my way back.
I love that.
And if you're playing with people that you trust, it's, you know, they'll hopefully help you find your way back, you know, not always. But I mean, taking chances is I mean, that's like half the fun, you know, seeing where you end up and seeing if you can find your way out and find your way back, whatever it is. But your point about jazz education is something that my colleagues and I talk about a lot because, you know, when I was coming out of high school in '88, I think there were maybe 10 colleges and universities that had a jazz program that maybe even had a jazz degree, and now everyone has one. You know, you can get a jazz studies degree literally down the street here in Montclair, New Jersey. I can get, you know, so that has so what has that done? Well, I think initially there's some initial risk taking that doesn't have to take place. Like when I went to University of North Texas and when I went to Berkeley, there were people from all over the country there, and the stakes were high. They were just like, you know, they had to be committed and they were there to work their butts off, you know. And there's something about it being a little easy, the accessibility being more prevalent has already kind of removed some of that risk taking. So I think, you know, everyone should have opportunities to do everything. I mean, it sounds really weird for me to say, you know, too many opportunities is ruining the music, but there is something to that. I think that's worth considering, you know. And then there are more problems. So then you also have folks teaching at these schools that have gone straight through and gotten their bachelor's and master's and doctorate, and they've never really gone out there and played and lived this music, but they have these degrees that actually give them a better chance of getting a gig teaching at these schools than the person who did go out and play for 20 years and only has a bachelor's degree. So, you know, that's kind of a major contradiction. So what happens? So the music gets watered down and it becomes kind of a series of things that are learned and stitched together. So this idea of spontaneity, this idea of developing a unique voice, you know, those things have gotten lost in music education. I mean, I think, you know, where I am at Princeton, it's just such a different environment. We're not a conservatory, you know, we have very few music majors. And so we can have these larger conversations about, uniqueness and how this music fits into the rest of the world, and what is it that we're actually trying to achieve beyond being able to just play over this chord progression in as perfect a way as possible. That's just kind of missing the point. So, yeah, jazz education's a very, very funny thing. It's actually pushed a lot of musicians far from, I think, the original spirit and intent of this music.
Right. And in, those old great recordings, especially when you get reissues, you would get a number of alternate takes, and you can compare them and try to see, well, why did they choose this one? Well, maybe the solo's a little better here. But those recordings went out with a lot of mistakes, and that's part of the beauty. Of course, these days, if you flub your solo, you could just overdub and, make a more perfect solo in the studio.
Yeah, you can keep punching in and, yeah, definitely.
And you hear things that are almost too perfect. And I think part of jazz, like you say, is getting yourself in a dangerous corner and seeing how you get out of it. That's a lot of the fun for me as a listener.
Right. It's energy, it's spontaneity, that sort of thing.
Well, there's this album that really made me think about a lot of these things I think it's called Blowing Session. It's like a recorded jam session of Coltrane and Johnny Griffin and Hank Mobley, I think.
Oh, right. I know that one. Yes.
With a great rhythm section that I can't remember. And just hearing those guys in the same room in this very informal context, and I mean, three players who couldn't be any more different than each other, and you there's something very special about that, about hearing three colleagues that have radically different approaches to the same music, but they are playing the same music. They're in the tradition of this thing that we call jazz, and I guess that just had a big impression on me. Not so much what they played. Obviously, they played great on that record, but just that sort of occurrence. That's what it should feel like when we get together with. If I'm going to get together with three other alto players, I would like to think that we all sound really, really different, and that shouldn't be hard to find. But I think it does get hard to find. There is this kind of sameness, and people coming from the same foundation.
Right. So I guess that leads us to what's next for you. What's coming up on the horizon that you know of, and what do you want to do in future projects or people you want to work with, kinds of music you want to try next?
Well, I have a few things going. Well, the trio has a few more shows this fall, and I think I would just like for the trio to be kind of a constant of something that I kind of keeps going regardless of whatever projects I'm working on, and I think that's going to make the most sense for me going forward. I'm recording a new album in a few weeks. It's a sort of retrospective. When you look at my discography, I mean, you've talked about a few different projects. I've written this music. It's a body of work. It's recorded. Hopefully we go play a bunch of gigs, and then I move on to the next thing, and that music doesn't get played anymore, Mm-hmm. I mean, the music from Mother Tongue hasn't been played since 2005, and for example. So I really want, and it was supposed to be in line with my 50th birthday, but my 50th was in the middle of COVID. But I wanted to go back and revisit some of my favorite compositions and re-record them with a couple of different bands. So there's going to be a band that's a bit more electric with David Gilmour and Reza Bassi, great electric bass player named Rich Brown, and Rudy Royston. And a wonderful young pianist named Alexis Lombre. So that's going to be one session that's a little more electric. And then the acoustic session is Adam O'Farrell is going to be on some of it. A really great young vocalist named Anson Jones, and a tenor player you may have heard of named Nicole Glover, who's very good.
Yeah, we've talked about her releases.
Yeah, and Nicole's going to be on there, and that's with Dan Weiss on drums and Francois Moutin on bass and Matt Mitchell on piano. So it's kind of a way of assembling, my favorite players that I've played with, and some of my favorite young players, and some of my favorite tunes, that I've written. Right. So I'm really looking forward to that. I don't know how that's coming out yet, but we're definitely recording. We have a date at the end of the month and a date at the beginning of September. I also have a collaboration with a rapper and a visual artist who does something. I guess he's an animator officially, but it's something more akin to Zoetrope, which, if you know, Zoetrope was predates film. So we're working on a project that's kind of a tribute to Mahatma Gandhi, but also kind of showcasing his influence as, a proponent of nonviolent protests. So, for example, there's a movement about Mandela. There's a movement about John Lewis. Cesar Chavez is going to be one. There's a movement about the Tiananmen Square uprising. So that's a really, really cool project. That's something that's me and lots of electronics and this rapper poet and this animator. So that's a project that has moved at snail's pace, but I'm hoping that we can maybe wrap it up at the end of the year and get that out there. So that's something that would be more in like performing arts centers and not so much like album oriented or club oriented. So those are the things I'm thinking about right now. It's been interesting for me to just hang out and play standards and play music that's been written by other people. Like I'd never really done that before. So it's been really fun to focus on that for 2 years. But now I feel like I'm really ready to write some music again.
Right.
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned earlier that a lot of jazz is going in an electronic direction. Do you see yourself like leading a project that ever does an electronic?
Well, I mean, it depends on to what degree electronic. But there's an album of mine that actually kind of flew under the radar called Samdi that came out in 2011. It was my first album for ACT. But that's very much an electric record. I'm playing with a bunch of effects and doing some programming and some software programming, and somehow something about that album. It didn't. A lot of people don't know about it, but it's one of my favorites, and we're actually going to re-record some music from that. So
cool!
It was kind of like the jazz rock fusion band I'd always wanted to have since I was in junior high. So,
do you see yourself doing something like that again then, or?
Well, I think that the half of that album that I'm recording upcoming is going to be something like that. But yeah, I think so. I would like to jump back into that. It's funny. It's like electronics is almost like learning another instrument. And I feel like when I'm deep in it, I'm really feeling it and really hearing it. But when I get away from it for a while, it's like not practicing the trumpet. I feel rusty. Like my electronics embouchure is shot. It takes a while to find it again. But I look forward to that. And there's so many great electronic musicians. Electronic music is very big at Princeton. It's been kind of in the musical DNA of the institution for many years. So I feel like I can get a lot of help and a lot of assistance and a lot of cool ideas and inspiration there. So that's been really great. I
certainly enjoy your acoustic work a lot. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing that as well. I have to go back and hear that electronic album now.
Yeah, you got to try to find it. It's called Samdi. It's Samdhi. Okay. It's definitely streaming.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess that's how we'd find it, yeah.
All right, well, there you have it, adult music audience. Anyone who by car, train, plane, horse, whatever you got, can get down to Smoke Jazz Club August 25th to 28th to hear Rudresh's trio. It's going to be exciting. Charlie Parker-inspired program with, sounds like a lot of other added elements, and maybe the Capes. You get to see the Capes.
Maybe the Capes, for sure,
That'll be great. So check that out. And Rudresh, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great, to talk to you about lots of different things. It was really, very fun for me.
Thanks a lot.
It was really interesting for us.
Yeah, thanks for those tips on what you've got coming up. We'll definitely keep our eye out for that. And
our ear out, yeah.
Yeah, ear out. And when they come out, we'll definitely get them in an episode, listen to them, and break them down for listeners.
Great, thank you.
Best of luck at the Smoke Jazz Club debut. I hope you and the audience have a great time.
Thank you so much.